Sometimes you read something in the financial world and it really makes you stop and think.
Definitely.
And today we've got one of those. We're doing a deep dive into something pretty surprising. Sweden. They're actually thinking about adding Bitcoin to their national reserves.
It is a real headline grabber, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sits right at that intersection of, finance, tech, geopolitics.
For sure.
And it gets people asking big questions about what national wealth might even look like down the road.
Absolutely. And you shared some really interesting background material for this, parts of a document. I think it was called Testo and Calato.
That's right. Yeah, it lays out the analysis of this Swedish move pretty well.
Okay, so for everyone listening, that's our source material.
Yeah.
And our mission today is really to unpack this whole thing. We want to figure out, where did this idea come from? What's the thinking behind it? And what could it mean, especially for the rest of Europe?
Right. Try and get a clear picture of a fairly complex situation.
Exactly. So by the end, you should have a good handle on it. Okay, so where did this Swedish idea kick off from? Was it completely out of the blue?
Well, what's interesting, and the source material highlights this, is that it's not like completely from nowhere, right?
Yeah.
There's a pretty clear line back to something that happened across the Atlantic.
In the U.S.?
Yeah, exactly. The material points to a U.S. initiative under the last administration that actually authorized setting up a strategic national reserve of Bitcoin.
Right. And I remember hearing something about how they planned to get the Bitcoin. It wasn't just like buying it with tax money, was it?
No, exactly. And that's crucial. The American plan, according to Testo and Calato, was designed to be budget neutral.
Budget neutral? How?
Well, the idea was to use funds and assets that had already been confiscated, through law enforcement seizures and things like that, use those to acquire the Bitcoin.
Ah, okay. So it neatly avoids the whole political fight about spending public money on, what many still see as a pretty volatile asset.
Precisely. It sidesteps that immediate political headache.
Which I guess leads us straight to why this American approach looks attractive to the person pushing this in Sweden, Riccardo Norden.
That seems to be the connection, yeah.
It's a pathway, potentially, to get Bitcoin onto the national books without needing a specific budget allocation for it. Kind of clever, in a way.
It is. And the analysis in the source suggests this points to maybe an evolution in thinking. Moving Bitcoin beyond just, speculation.
Right.
It starts treating it more like a potential strategic asset, something a country might hold, like they hold gold reserves traditionally.
That's a big conceptual jump for a government, isn't it?
It really is. Thinking of it as part of the national treasure, so to speak.
Okay, so we see the U.S. influence there. Let's zoom in on the Swedish proposal itself then. Tell us more about Riccardo Norden and what he's actually arguing for.
Sure. So Riccardo Norden, as the source states, he's a member of the Swedish parliament, the Riksdag. And he's taken a pretty formal step here. He wrote an open letter directly to Sweden's Minister for Finance.
Elizabeth Svantesson.
That's the one. And in this letter, he basically lays out the case for why Sweden should seriously look at making Bitcoin an integral part of its national currency reserves.
Okay, and what's the core of his case? What are the main reasons he gives, according to the material?
His main points kind of boil down to two things, really. First, he frames Bitcoin as a potential, maybe even critical, hedge against inflation.
Okay.
With traditional currencies sometimes losing value, Bitcoin's fixed supply looks appealing as a way to maybe preserve national wealth over the long term.
Makes sense. And the second point?
The second is this idea of Bitcoin as an instrument of financial freedom.
Interesting angle. What does he mean by that?
Well, particularly thinking about unstable geopolitical situations or places where people might face, say, oppressive regimes or economic chaos, Bitcoin could offer individuals a way to control their own assets outside traditional systems.
That financial freedom idea, it does sound a bit like the traditional arguments for gold, doesn't it? As a safe haven asset, you can hold yourself in uncertain times.
Exactly. Norden is essentially drawing that parallel.
Yeah.
He's suggesting that, in our digital age, Bitcoin could play a role similar to the one gold has played historically in the physical world.
Right.
And crucially, as we mentioned, he keeps emphasizing that budget-neutral strategy using confiscated assets.
Yeah, that seems key for political viability.
Absolutely. It directly tackles the concern about risking public funds on Bitcoin investment, which would likely be a major sticking point otherwise.
Okay, so Sweden's got this proposal, maybe a clever way to fund it. But what's the vibe across the rest of Europe? It doesn't feel like the EU is exactly jumping on the Bitcoin reserve bandwagon.
No, you're absolutely right there. The general picture in Europe, as Testo and Calato
Yeah.
describes it, is, well, it's one of significant caution, maybe even resistance when it comes to governments holding Bitcoin reserves.
So what are they focusing on then?
The European Union, Brussels and the ECB, they are laser focused on developing and rolling out their own digital currency, the central bank digital currency, or CBDC, the digital euro.
Ah, yes, the digital euro. That's clearly the big priority.
Unquestionably. That's where their energy and strategic thinking around digital money seems to be concentrated.
And Christine Lagarde, the ECB president, her statements seem to really capture that cautious EU position, right?
They do, yeah. Her perspective, as the source points out, is quite different from, say, the noise we heard from the US a while back about maybe even blocking a digital dollar.
Right, the opposite approach almost.
Exactly. The EU is actively pursuing its digital euro. It signals a really different underlying philosophy about money, control, and the role of the state in the digital future. Centralized control is the EU's path, it seems.
Which contrasts sharply with this Swedish idea, inspired by the US, of embracing a decentralized asset like Bitcoin.
Precisely. It highlights a fundamental difference in how they see the future. Centralized digital currency controlled by the central bank versus incorporating existing decentralized digital assets. Different worlds, really.
It does feel like a real philosophical split. Beliefs about monetary control, innovation versus stability, all wrapped up in this.
That's a good way to put it. Different core beliefs about how finance should work in the 21st century.
So, given this general European hesitation, maybe even skepticism, how big a deal is this Swedish proposal? Could it actually shift things?
Well, the analysis in Testo and Calato calls the Swedish proposal a potential breach in the EU's kind of unified stance. And I think that's a really interesting way to frame it.
A breach. Even though Sweden isn't in the Eurozone.
Right, even though they're not using the euro, Sweden's economic policies still get noticed. They're influential. This proposal, just by being seriously discussed, could reopen the debate within other EU countries about whether Bitcoin has a legitimate place on a national balance sheet.
So the ripple effect might be significant, even if Sweden itself ultimately decides against it.
Exactly. Just the conversation happening at this level could act as a catalyst. The source even suggests it might spark a kind of domino effect, potentially encouraging other EU nations, maybe ones already a bit more crypto-friendly, to start thinking along similar lines. And maybe more broadly, it could force Brussels to engage more seriously with decentralized assets like Bitcoin.
Instead of just focusing solely on the digital euro.
Right. It might push them to really compare the pros and cons. How does Bitcoin fit or not fit alongside their own CBDC plans? It could prompt a more nuanced evaluation.
Okay, fascinating. Let's play this out hypothetically then. Let's say Sweden does go ahead and adopt this proposal. What would be the main consequences, the key implications we might expect?
Well, if Sweden were to actually implement this, the ripple effects could be pretty substantial. First off, as Testo and Calato really stresses, it would be a huge boost for Bitcoin's legitimization globally.
How so?
Having a respected nation-state officially add Bitcoin to its reserves, that elevates its status significantly. It moves it further away from just being seen as, a purely speculative plaything for retail investors. It gets a stamp of approval, almost.
Okay, legitimacy. What about tangible things like the price?
Well, from a pure market perspective, a country starting to accumulate Bitcoin, even if it's initially with these confiscated funds, that adds a new source of demand. It could put upward pressure on the price over time.
Right, a new, potentially large buyer entering the market.
Even if it starts small, it signals that a nation sees some value in holding it long term.
And beyond just price, could it set a precedent for other countries?
Absolutely. The Swedish move, if it happens and proves workable, could definitely serve as a kind of template or precedent. Other nations, both inside the EU and outside, might look at it and say, maybe we should explore this.
So it could encourage wider adoption at the state level?
It certainly could. It might normalize the idea of including Bitcoin or maybe even other cryptos as a small part of national reserve strategies.
And thinking about the bigger players, the EU and the US, we've talked about their different tracks. Could this Swedish move stir things up between them?
That's a really interesting point. This divergence, the EU pushing its centralized digital euro, while an EU member state, even non-Eurozone, explores a US-inspired decentralized model that could definitely create some new dynamics.
Potential friction.
Potential friction within the EU itself, maybe, and perhaps new discussions or even tensions in the transatlantic relationship.
Yeah.
It really touches on fundamental questions about, monetary sovereignty in this digital era. Who controls the future of money?
And finally, you mentioned the digital euro debate earlier. How might this Swedish idea, even if it just remains a proposal, affect the EU's own CBDC project?
Well, by putting a concrete, decentralized alternative on the table, the Swedish proposal could fuel a more critical discussion about the digital euro itself.
In what way?
It might encourage policymakers, and maybe even the public, to think harder about the trade-offs. What are the potential downsides of a purely centralized digital currency system compared to maybe a more mixed approach? Does a CBDC limit financial freedom in ways Bitcoin doesn't? How does each affect innovation? It forces a comparison.
Right, it highlights that there are different paths forward in digital currency.
Exactly. It brings the choices and the inherent trade-offs of those choices into sharper focus.
So, wrapping this up then, it really feels like this Swedish proposal, whatever happens next, is actually quite significant. It marks a moment, perhaps, in how governments are starting to think about Bitcoin, even if Europe generally remains cautious.
I think that's right. It really throws that contrast into sharp relief, doesn't it? The US-inspired idea of integrating a decentralized asset versus the EU's strong commitment to its own centralized digital euro. Two very different visions clashing in a way.
Which leads perfectly to a final thought for our listeners to chew on. What does this split, this divergence in strategy between the US-Swedish approach and the EU's approach actually signal about where global money systems might be heading? What's the long-term future for decentralized currencies like Bitcoin versus centralized ones like the digital euro? And maybe even more fundamentally, what could these different paths mean for us, for individual financial freedom, and for how nations manage their economies down the line?
Yeah.
Definitely something to think about. It's much bigger than just the day-to-day price swings. There are some major forces at play here.